on 15a at the Mishnah. Reini Nazir Likshiheli Ben V'Nazir Me'ayim. This fellow says I should be a Nazir when I have a child and a Nazir for 100 days. It's interesting. There's a bit of a debate here, but according to Tosfos' understanding, this would mean that as follows: Ben Ad Shivim, if he has a son born to him before the 70th day. Tosfos points out that this is only in a situation where you interrupted your Nazirus. So if the guy was counting twice, let's say the second scenario of our Mishnah, which is where the guy says, I am a Nazir, and I'm a Nazir when my son is born. So in that situation, he's a Nazir for himself first for 30 days. Let's say his son is born 20 days into that Nazirus. So when he concludes his own Nazirus, he immediately starts counting for his son. But since he concluded his own Nazirus, if it becomes Tameh during his son's Nazirus, then it only, according to everybody, it only ends his son's. He only loses the days of his son's Nazirus. When Rabbi Yochanan says you interrupt both Nazirus, you have to count both over again. It's a scenario where you interrupted your own personal Nazirus. So he was a Nazir for 20 days, then he started counting 20 days of Nazirus for his son, and then he became Tameh. Rabbi Yochanan says you lose your Nazirus from both your personal one and the one in honor of your son. Okay. You lose the days. That means that once you become tahar, you have to count again for your personal Nazirus plus the Nazirus of your son. Rabbi Yochanan says you lose the days of both Nazirus. Chad and Nazirus arechta. It's considered one long Nazirus, and that's because you don't shave your head and bring the korbanos until the end of both Nazirus. Rish Lakish Amar Eines Seiser Nazirus Didei Lechud U'Dibrei Lechud. Rish Lakish says it's considered two separate categories of Nazirus. One Nazirus in honor of his son, one Nazirus in his honor. Okay. Nitma b'meit tzaratai. This is an interesting halacha. Let's say somebody's a Nazir, and then he becomes a Mitzorah. So Mitzorah is a spiritual affliction of leprosy, and the Kohen locks him up for 7 days, and then he decides the blemish grew, and he exiles him. Once he's in exile, he is not allowed to count those days for Nazir. So the guy is a Mitzorah, and he also was a Nazir before he became a Mitzorah, and then he becomes Tameh. Does he lose the days of his Nazirus? Because his Nazirus really now is on pause, because he's a Mitzorah. So Rabbi Yochanan says you lose the days. Rish Lakish Amar Eines Seiser. Rish Lakish says you don't lose it. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Seiser, the Haba Nazirus Kai, because he's in the middle. Ultimately, he is in the middle of his Nazirus. Rish Lakish Amar Eines Seiser. Rish Lakish says you don't lose the days. It's a Ras Lechud Nazirus Lechud. He's in the middle of being a Mitzorah. He's not a Nazir now, and therefore you don't lose the time. Okay, this seems to be a repeat of the same disagreement. So the Gemara says it's tzricha. I needed to repeat it. Both Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish needed to repeat themselves. Why? Because if it would have just said the first scenario, in other words, a scenario with two Nazirus, one in honor of his son, one in his own honor. Okay, so in other words, in that scenario, Bahi Amar, I'm online. Oh, Charles came back. She just came back.
Yeah. Did you go down? Did you go offline or something?
I don't think I went down.
Yeah.
I did notice that you were gone. Okay. Utzricha. So okay, again. So in the scenario of the two Nazirus, one in honor of him, one in honor of his son, the Etmar Bahach Kamais, if would have just said that scenario, by he Amar Bechon Seiser. In that scenario, Bechon would have said that you lose your time. Why? Because Shem Nazirus Achasim. Because ultimately you became Tameh during a period of Nazirus. And ultimately that Nazirus was interrupting another period of Nazirus. It's one Nazirus, Ava Bahal. But in the scenario where the guy's a Mitzorah, I would think maybe he agrees for Rish Lakish because ultimately the guy became Tameh when he was a Mitzorah. The Nazir l'chod utzaras l'chod. Nazir and Mitzorah are two separate things, and therefore you don't lose your time. Viet Mar Bahal, and if it would have just said the scenario of Mitzorah, I would say Bahakam or Rish Lakish. Rish Lakish disagrees in the scenario of Mitzvah because in Mitzvah, you're a different type of person. You're not a Nazir. But in the scenario of two Naziris, one for you, one for your son, and maybe he would agree to Rabbi Yechanan that you do lose the time of both Naziris. So Gemara said Tzricha, therefore it had to say both cases. Okay. Okay, now you have an interesting scenario. Let's say a guy accepts Naziris for 30 days, right? Guys are regular Nazir. Okay, and what happens is on the third day, let's say the 10th day of his Naziris, he's attacked by highwaymen and they shave his head. So, okay, so now obviously the guy is innocent. He does not get any penalty for this, right? There's nothing he can do about it. And he's still a Nazir because we said shaving your, becoming Tameh makes you lose the days of your Naziris. But if the guy was forced to drink wine or somebody cut his hair, he doesn't lose his time. However, when he concludes his Naziris, he needs 30 days worth of growth. So in this case, he's a Nazir for 10 days. He's a Nazir for another 20 days, and he still can't bring his karbanos for another 10 days. Because those 10 days would be the 10 days he has to grow his hair, so he has 30 days worth of growth. Okay. Okay, and then what happens? So he has the first 30 days, then another 10 days where he has to grow his hair. During that last 10 days, he became Tameh. Now what do you do? So Nitna b'yom gidol sar. He became Tameh on the days that he needed to grow his hair. Rav says, Ein Saiser. Rav says, look, ultimately you finished the Naziris, right? And he did complete the Naziris, completed the Naziris, let's say 10 days ago. Afil Rabbi Yechanan, to Amar Saiser, even Rabbi Yechanan, that says that you typically would lose the time if you became Tameh. That's where you interrupted. When you're in the middle of a Naziris, because you're in the middle of an interruption, whether the interruption is due to the fact that you accepted a second type of Naziris in honor of your son, or whether the interruption is due to the fact that you're a Mitzvah, but you're still in the middle of Naziris. However, Gidol Sar Mishnah Naziris. So in the scenario where he's already counted a full 30 days of Naziris, now he's only waiting 10 days to grow his hair. He finished the Naziris, you become Tameh, you don't lose all the time. That's the opinion of Rav. Shmuel says the opposite. Saiser, you lose all of your time. Afil Rish Lakish to Amar Ein Saiser, even though Rish Lakish says you don't lose your time. In a case of an interruption, whether the interruption is because you're a Mitzvah, whether the interruption is because you're counting a different Naziris now. Hasim Shtei Naziris. That's because over there it's two separate Naziris. It's a separate category. However, Nazirusa. Over here, this time of waiting to be able to cut your hair is an extension of Nazir. And therefore, because it's an extension of the first Naziris, therefore you lose all your time and you have to restart. Okay. Amar of Chisda said as following. Hakol maidim shem kodesh sar b'dam ein lo takana. So let's say the guy. Okay, so when a Nazir ends his Naziris, first thing is he brings 3 sacrifices. Those karbanos are called kiddush sar. In other words, they sanctify the hair. And then after they're completed, the hair is cut off and it's burnt. So let's say he brings the karbanos, okay, and before he has a chance to cut his hair, he becomes Tameh. So in Eila Takana, there's no solution. So the Gemara examines this question. What does it mean there's no solution? So presumably it means the guy ends up being a Nazir forever. Well, why is that? Let's think about that. The Gemara says, Aliba Deman, according to which opinion? Aliba de Rabbi Lazar. Rabbi Lazar says that it's that shaving your head is a critical component of ending the Naziris. Since he says shaving the Nazir's head is ma'akev, it's an important, it's the conclusion of Naziris, and you need to have it. So then it's still part of the Nazir, Velistar, and he should lose all his time, and he should have to restart and count again, and then end in Naziris again. It's according to the opinion of the rabbis. They say the conclusion of Naziris is in time. It's not with shaving your heads. And therefore, he's already concluded his Naziris. So he concluded it. So what's the big deal? Why is he a permanent Nazir forever? So the Gemara says, you're right. We're going according to the rabbi's opinion. What does it mean? There's no solution. It doesn't mean he's a permanent Nazir. What it means is because now he's tamei, he cannot complete the mitzvah of shaving his head. And once he becomes tahar, it's too late because the sacrifices have already been brought. So this typically a Nazir, when he completes his Nazir, he has a mitzvah to shave his head. This Nazir does not.
Which is done first? Shaving the head or
Korbanos. Yeah. Okay, 1 second. Okay, Amar V'yasi. Rav Yasi said, made the following statement: Nazir shekol lo yamav. A Nazir on the last day he finishes his Naziris. Loike ala tuma ve'ena loike ala tagalachas. He gets malchus for becoming tamei, but does not get malchus for shaving his head, v'lo ala yayin, and not for drinking wine. And the question is, why not? What's the difference? So he's concluded his Naziris. He's at the last day, so he's finished it. And then he becomes tamei. Tuma is different. If he shaves his head before the right time, maybe before the korbanos, or he drinks wine before the korbanos, he does not get malchus because he finishes Naziris. But if he shaves his head, if he becomes tamei, then he does get malchus. The Gemara says, "Ma'ishna tuma." Why is tuma different? The lucky that he gets malchus. The Amakra, the verse states, "Kol yemei hazira l'Hashem l'rabes yom shel acham alais." Okay, it's interesting. Taisus points out makes an interesting point here, which we'll soon see, which is that actually, if you become tamei on the last day, then rabbinically, in other words, the last day of your Naziris, rabbinically, they gave all the prohibitions until you actually shave your head, bring the korbanos and shave your head. Until that happens, you have all the prohibitions. However, let's say the guy delayed a day. So he had 30-day Naziris. Instead of bringing his korbanos on day number 30, he waited around until day number 32. And he becomes tamei on day 32 before the korbanos are brought. Mm-hmm. This is what we're talking about. So the halacha is you keep all the laws in Naziris until you bring the korbanos. What happens if you broke the laws? So if you break them on the day, rabbinically, you get malchus for everything. It's all prohibited. But let's say you waited. You're on day number 32 for a 30-day Naziris, and you become tamei that day. Rabbi Yossi is saying that you get malchus for tumah, but do not get malchus for drinking or for shaving your head, even though all three of those are prohibited until he brings the korbanos and shaves his head. So the Gemara wants to know what's the difference. So presumably the Gemara says, because when it comes to tumah, it says, Kol yemei neder, nizroi, as long as he's a Nazir, ta'ar lo yavar al roshai. A razor will not go on his head. La says yom shel achar malais, yom shel fnei malais. To make the days that are after the completion of his Naziris, like the days that are before the completion. Okay, presumably that means that Kol Yemei Neder Nizrei, all the days of the Neder include the days up until the day that you bring korbanos, even though you've already completed the Naziris. So the Gemara says, well, if that's the case, V'su Kol Yemei Nizrei, the words Kol Yemei Nizrei are used with regard to the other prohibitions. The same terminology is used also by drinking, by consuming any grape products. 1 second, I skip one. I'm sorry, I did. The Amrach of 5 lines on top, 5 lines on top of the bottom. 6 lines actually. 1 second. So you see the same terminology. As long as he's in Nazir, meaning before he brings the korbanos, he can't shave his head. Presumably that means that if you shave his head up unto and including the last day, then even though he's concluded the Naziris, but he hasn't brought his korbanos, it should also be a prohibition. You should also get malchus. V'su, and the same thing is true with regard to wine. You should say the same thing is true with regard to drinking wine. Okay, so the Gemara says no. In other words, all of these verses that say Kol Yomei Neder Nizrei, that means as long as you're a Nazir. But once you're at day number 32, you're not a Nazir anymore. And the truth of the matter is that none of them prohibit you after day 30 from drinking. So why is Tumah different? Because it says Shani Hachad Amar Achmana V'Timei Rosh Nizrei. He becomes Tameh when his head is a Nazir. Now he doesn't shave his head until after he brings the Karbanos. So even though he's completed his days of Nazir, he's still a Rosh Nizrei. His head has long hair. Mish Nizrei Toile B'Roisha. As the definition of, with regard to Tumah, the definition of Nazir is not just whether he completed the days of his Naziris, but whether his head is shaved or not. Okay. And now the Gemara ends off with a very difficult question. Meisvei. Gemara has the following question. It's a Tosefta. It's a set of brises. So this is a Tanakh literature, right? It's written the same time as the Mishnah. Meisvei, we learn in the brisa, Nazir shekol yamav, a Nazir that concludes his Naziris. Osur legaleach v'lishtus yain l'tam l'meisam. He's not allowed to shave his head, drink wine, or become tamei. And if he did it, v'im gilach, he shaved his head. V'shas yain, he drank wine. V'nitma l'meisam, he became tamei. I raise a seifik asarbam. You do get malchus. Straight contradiction to the opinion we just brought. The opinion of Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina. And the Gemara concludes with Tiyufta, you're right, it is a difficult question, and it remains unresolved. Okay. Very good.